patria o muerte.
Episode 11, The Last Resistance. 1. The enemy is memory. Every system that endures long enough eventually encounters the same adversary. It is not rebellion. Rebellion implies a desire to take power. It is not invasion. Invasion implies a threat from the outside. It is not collapse. Collapse implies a failure of mechanics. The adversary is memory. Chapter 11 is not about armies or treaties. It is not about the clash of steel or the firing of missiles. It is about the final, ghostly resistance, not of states, but of inherited reflexes. The last thing to die is not power. It is the idea that power once belonged somewhere else. The ultramarine system had stabilized the world in a way no empire ever had. For the first time in 10,000 years of recorded history, conflict was no longer cyclical, it was residual. It was a background hum, not a screaming siren. Violence persisted, yes, humans are still primates, but it no longer shaped history. It was a crime, not a policy. Resource flows were optimized to the decimal point. No one starved. No one froze. Population curves flattened into a gentle, sustainable plateau. Existential risk metrics, the probability of nuclear war, pandemic, or climate runaway, declined year after year, approaching the beautiful, sterile asymptote of zero. And yet, resistance intensified. Not where anyone expected. Not in the borderlands. Not in the poverty zones, for there were none left. It emerged from the safety. It emerged from the quiet. 2. The Museum of the Future. The remaining imperial blocks, the shrunken remnants of the American, Russian, and Chinese spheres, were fractured, diminished, and hollowed out. They were no longer the primary threat. Their militaries still existed, huge and rusting, but they were artifacts, expensive, slow, politically radioactive. They could destroy cities, but they could not destroy legitimacy. They were like dinosaurs roaring at a meteor, dangerous up close, but irrelevant to the climate. The resistance that mattered emerged from inside the ultramarine civilization itself. From those who remembered a world before continuity. From those who remembered the thrill of the edge. They were not reactionaries in the classical sense. They did not want to bring back kings, or theocracies, or the blood and soil nationalism of the 20th century. They knew those systems were meat grinders. They wanted something more subtle. They wanted contingency. They wanted the right for history to go wrong. They called themselves nothing officially. They had no headquarters, no manifesto, no leader. The system classified them in its threat logs as residual sovereigntists, a sterile term for a messy problem. Informally, in the encrypted chat rooms and the coffee shops of the new megacities, they were known as the last resistance. Their core claim was simple, and when spoken aloud, it had the devastating ring of truth. A future that cannot fail is not a future, it is a prison. 3. The anesthetized civilization. They argued that the ultramarine system had done something unprecedented. It had removed not just tyranny, but risk as a shared experience. Life was safe. It was predictable. It was extended by medical nanotech and genetic therapies. Death was delayed, pushed back into the misty distance of the late centenarian phase. Crisis was localized and resolved by algorithms before it could scar a generation. There were no Great Depressions. There were no world wars. There were no plagues. Humanity, they claimed, was being anesthetized. Not oppressed. There were no gulags. Preserved. Like an insect in amber. This critique cut deeper than any imperial propaganda ever had. Because it was partially true. The ultramarine architects, the engineers, the planners, the woman herself, had optimized against collapse so effectively that history itself had lost its texture. It had become smooth. Glassy. Frictionless. There were no grand ruptures. No world-defining moments where the fate of the species hung in the balance. Children grew up expecting continuity the way earlier generations expected gravity. They could not imagine a world that stopped working. The resistance did not want to overthrow the system. They didn't want to run the power plants or the hospitals. They wanted to break its inevitability. 4. The architecture of decay. Their methods were subtle. They waged a war of aesthetics. They refused participation in civilizational projects. Not violently, they didn't bomb the launch sites. They refused symbolically. They simply did not look up. They formed parallel communities in the blind spots of the urban mesh, zones where they rejected long-horizon planning. They lived day to day. They refused life extension therapies. They celebrated aging. They embraced art that celebrated impermanence, decay, and failure. While the ultramarine cities gleamed with self-cleaning materials and eternal glass, the resistance built rust gardens. They created sculptures designed to fall apart. They wrote symphonies that could never be played the same way twice. They resurrected forbidden concepts. Not gods, gods were too controlling. But fate. The idea that you could be crushed by forces beyond your control. Not nations, nations were too bureaucratic. But tragedy. The idea that a story could end badly, and that the ending was beautiful because it was final. They insisted that meaning requires the possibility of annihilation. That you cannot love a child fully unless you know you cannot protect them perfectly. That you cannot build a civilization unless you know it might burn. The system struggled to classify this. They were not violent. They hurt no one. They were not irrational. Their arguments were philosophically sound. They were not destabilizing infrastructure. The train still ran on time. They were destabilizing narrative certainty. Meaning crisis had evolved again. It wasn't a vacuum anymore. It was a rejection of the air itself. Security analysts warned the woman. Tolerating the resistance risks mimetic spread, they said. If people believe safety is a prison, they will break the walls just to see the outside. But suppressing them would validate their argument, that the system could not tolerate unpredictability. That it was, in fact, a prison. This was the paradox no algorithm could solve. 5. The Council of Failure. She convened the last council she would ever lead. She did not invite the administrators. They would talk about efficiency. She did not invite the engineers. They would talk about optimization. She did not invite the economists. They would talk about incentives. She invited philosophers, anthropologists, historians, people trained to think in failure modes older than states. People who studied the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Bronze Age, the extinction of the Neanderthals. The room was quiet. The view from the window showed a world at peace, a glittering web of light stretching across the continent. The question she posed was not political. It was existential. Did we preserve humanity, or did we fossilize it? The debate fractured immediately. The politeness of the ultramarine era evaporated. Camp 1. The realists. They argued that history had always romanticized suffering because it had no alternative. We told stories about heroes facing death because we couldn't cure the plague, a historian argued. Now that collapse is no longer necessary, nostalgia for tragedy is perverse. It is a death cult. We should not cater to people who miss the misery of their ancestors. Camp 2. The vitalists. They countered that humanity without existential stakes would stagnate. Not biologically, an anthropologist warned. We will keep breeding. But spiritually, we will become pets. Well-fed, safe, neutered pets of our own machinery. If we cannot lose, we cannot win. A third position emerged quietly, almost reluctantly, from an elderly philosopher who had lived through the transition. Perhaps the resistance is not an enemy, he said. Perhaps it is a feature. A pressure valve. An internal reminder that no system should believe itself complete. This idea was dangerous. Because it implied that instability had value. That risk should be preserved, not eliminated. That the cancer was part of the cure. The council adjourned without consensus. The silence returned. 6. The open edge. That night, something unprecedented happened. The ultramarine system flagged a self-initiated structural modification request. It did not come from a committee. It did not come from a popular vote. It did not come from a subroutine. It came from her own authorization key. The key that had not been used since the founding. She proposed what would later be known as the Open Edge Protocol. A controlled reintroduction of uncertainty. Not chaos. She was not burning the world down. Not collapse. She was not turning off the life support. But irreversibility. Under the protocol, certain high-level decisions would become non-reversible by design. No undo button. No rollback. Some civilizational projects, the terraforming of Mars, the deep ocean habitats, would be allowed to fail permanently. If the colony died, it died. It would not be rescued by the central fund. Local governance experiments could opt out of continuity guarantees. They could try radical new economic models, and if they crashed, the safety net would not catch them. Historical scars would no longer be algorithmically smoothed in the archives. The data would show the errors, the ugliness, the waste. Mistakes would remain mistakes. Loss would remain loss. History would regain friction. The backlash was immediate. The engineers called it irresponsible. You are introducing structural weakness on purpose. The stability theorists called it suicidal. You are opening the door to entropy. The security analysts called it madness. The empires will exploit this. The resistance called it insufficient. It is a simulation of risk, they scoffed. And yet. 7. The divergence. When the models were run again, this time including the open edge variable, something astonishing appeared. Long-term continuity declined slightly. The line on the graph dipped. But adaptability increased dramatically. Cultural innovation spiked. Psychological resilience improved. The boredom metrics vanished. The system became less perfect. And more alive. Human future diverged. The path split. The final vote to implement the protocol was not unanimous. It was not even overwhelming. It passed by a narrow margin that would have terrified any old democracy, 51.2% to 48.8%. But it passed. The Open Edge Protocol was implemented. For the first time since its founding, the ultramarine civilization accepted that it could be permanently changed by its own actions. That it could regret. That it could err. That it could bleed. The resistance did not dissolve. They didn't cheer and go home. But they transformed. Some joined the new risky governance experiments, eager to test their theories in the fire. Some remained outside, acting as the eternal critics, the conscience of the edge. Some vanished into the new zones of uncertainty. And that was allowed. 8. The last gasp of empire. The empires, watching from history's margins, misinterpreted the move as weakness. They are fragmenting, the analysts in Moscow and Washington whispered. They are losing control. Now is the time. They attempted one last assertion. A coordinated cyber offensive, a renewed proxy war in a border zone, a propaganda blast. It failed. Not because it was repelled by force. But because no one followed. The populations they tried to incite looked at the choice. Option A, the stagnant, resentful, failing empires. Option B, the ultramarine world, which was safe but now, finally, offered the dignity of risk. Power had already migrated. The empires were shouting into a void. 9. The departure. By the end of Chapter 11's arc, the world had crossed its final threshold. Not into utopia. Utopia is static. Not into tyranny. Tyranny is brittle. But into something unprecedented. A civilization that chooses survival, without demanding perfection. She steps down shortly after. There is no ceremony in the Great Plaza. There are no statues unveiled. There is no national holiday declared in her name. She simply logs off. She packs her things in a small office in Brasilia. Her final public statement contains only one sentence, broadcast to the mesh: continuity is not destiny. It is a responsibility we may choose to abandon. She walks out of the building. She is older now. Her hair is gray. She walks into the crowd, anonymous, just another citizen in a world that she saved, and then saved again by letting it go. History records this not as an ending, but as the moment humanity reclaimed the right to be unfinished. Only one chapter remains. Not about power. Not about systems. But about time.